Hey guys, Miss Osuna here. Let's do some weaving stitches. So here I have several strands all set up, and what I'm gonna do is use these several strands to create a sumac stitch. All right, let's go on ahead. Get several strands of your favorite colors. I have 8 strands here. It doesn't matter however many you want to use. You're going to start by having the folded edge on one hand and then the tail in the other hand. So my length is about 36 inches long. You're going to fold so that the fold is in one hand and the tail of the strands are in the other hand. So I've got my yarns, got my loom, let's do it. All right, so I'm gonna take my loop. I'm gonna go under my first 2 left warp threads. So here I am having my loop. Remember, the loop was in one end, that's on my left hand, and then the tail's on my right hand. So on the left side of my warp, my first 2 threads, I'm doing 2 warp yarns at a time because my strands here are mini, and so it's nice and thick. You could do 1 if you wanted, but I'm gonna do 2 at a time because this is really thick. I have about 8 ply. So now that I'm under the first 2 warp threads, I'm gonna take the tail from my right hand, pull it through that loop, and now the tail's in my left hand, and you can see this loop starts to form, and I'm gonna pull this back this way. Okay, so I pulled it through, and now I'm gonna pull back towards the right, and that tightens. Just make sure you don't pull it too tight because remember our selvage, we need it to be nice and straight. So that's my first one. And now that was to get started. So I went underneath the first 2 warp. Now I'm gonna be over the rest of the warp yarns as I go across. So I'm working left to right, keeping these 2 sides open. I'm gonna reach in under the next 2, take my tail, and pull it through the loop. So those are my ends, and they are coming through. And once again, it was in my right hand. I pulled it through to my left hand and now pull back to the right. And that's the second stitch of our sumac. And pull gently, slightly to the left at first and then over to the right, still keeping everything separated, one half from the other. And once again, don't pull your selvage too tightly. And remember, everything on your selvage edges here, we are going to individually take them and put them through an eye of a needle and then run it through one of our warp tunnels. So for now, they just tuck in if you have any leftovers. So now, once again, here I am. I have these 2 separated, and I'm over the next 2 warp threads, and my tail goes under, and it comes to the left. Gently pull it with my left hand now and back to the right so that you can totally understand this stitch. You just really have to do it several times in a row. So it looks like a braid. This is the sumac. Once again, keeping these 2 separate, I'm over my next 2 warp thread. My hand goes through, and so now my tail can go under the warp to my left hand, and still keeping these 2 separate. And you can pull gently with the left and now pull back to the right. Again, the pulling is always very gentle on your weaving because we want to keep everything straight. And then you just beat it with a comb. I'm just using my fingers because I have a very thick sumac. I'll do one more here for you. And we go on top of the next 2 warp threads, keeping these 2 separate. And now the tail goes under from right hand to left hand, keeping these 2 separate. Gently start to pull on each side, and then now we can pull to the right. And as you're pulling, remember it's always very gentle because you do not want to ruin your warp threads by having them too tight. And you can tell if it's too tight if the selvage starts to come in, so I always do pull as I am going to make sure it's not just easily getting a little tight. Okay, again, this will be the last one that I'll do. We are here 2 pieces separate. We're over the next 2 warp threads. I'm gonna go and reach my fingers under, take that tail, and from my right hand, the tail goes to the left hand, and I have a loop forming. Keeping those 2 separate, pull gently on the first and second part of your loop there towards the left, and then to finish that off, you pull slightly and gently towards the right, and you can see that sumac stitch. We will practice this many times in order to create the look that works best for your specific designs. And that's it for our sumac stitch. When we first started, just to repeat, we went under the first 2 and our loop was on the left, and then everything else was over. And that was just to start so that you can see the first sumac from the selvage. Then everything else was over the next 2, and you kept these separate, and you reach underneath, keeping those separate, past the tail from the right hand over to the left hand, and gently pull slightly towards the left at first, just to tighten up your loop, and then towards the right, and you beat down from the top. That's our sumac. Now I'm gonna do a pile stitch. So it's gonna start off over, under, which is our plain weave. So I have threaded my needle. This is just our giant needle for our weaving, and it's for yarn with a big, it's plastic and it has a big eye. So over, under, and I'm working from right to left in this case, just to go on ahead and get it started. And once you get this all the way across, all you do is pull. So I'm doing over, under individually, just our plain weave. It's also tabby weave is another name for it, but it is truly the plain weave. That's the most common and international name. So we are just doing our plain weave to get started, over, under. So I started on the over because the last round from my previous row was under. So over, under, you got your plain weave happening. And then you're gonna pull, and that'll give you a pile. So this is key when you are doing your weaving, to make sure that you keep everything loose at first. That's a big thing. And then, so now that I've completed this row, after you keep everything loose at first, then the other thing is to make sure that you have the arc. See how there's a curve here? You always want that curve. And then when you beat down, it's not too tight. So now in this case, because I wanted to do a pile, I'm gonna take the yarn out of the weaving needle, and all we do is pull forward. So wherever we have, so this is my tail. Remember, these tails get tucked in on the far left and right. So I'm gonna just pull that nice, and I'm gonna loosen this up again. So I have a tail here on the right, a tail here on the left, and now everywhere where we are over, you just pull forward and beat that down. That gives you a very cool pile. So chenille is a nice way to go as far as using chenille yarn. Something nice and bulky is a really good option. I brought in the very bulky option of a navy blue, and that's also a good option. And you pull them as tightly as you want, all of the spaces where we are over. And it's just a little pull, but it gives you a very nice pile. And that texture, when you repeat it again and again and again, is super interesting and diverse for your tapestries. All right, so there's the pile. And now you want to do a plain weave on top of your pile, and then repeat that process, and we're gonna beat it down. So here we have another row of plain weave. All right, so my next row of plain weave is gonna be with our camel color. And we are under, over. So plain weave again. Always start off in a habit. I'm going to be starting off as my habit is from the right side of the loom to the left. You can choose either way, but just be consistent. So there's the plain weave on top. And remember, it depends on your last row, the previous row before. So in my case, my previous one here meant that I started under because you want to make sure it's always over under for your plain weave. So if the last one was under, you go over. If the last one was over, you go under. But you can see the plain weave, when you beat it down, secures and holds in the pile. So your pile is really a nice, fun texture. And again, that works best with a really thick, chunky yarn or with several ply of a thinner yarn. So I'm just going to pull that to make sure I'm pulling it to the height that I want. So however far away from the piece I want it to be. If you don't want it super far away, then keep it nice and close. But I'm going to go on ahead and pull it. And then once again, I'm going to continue this plain weave right on top. But that is how we do our pile. And it alternates with our plain weave. The plain weave secures the pile. And remembering again, when you're doing the plain weave, you want to have that arc, because as you go across, see how I have a little bit of a curve? Then you pull down on it, and when you beat down, it makes sure that your warp threads are not being pulled too tightly. So you can have a longer length. I tend to go in shorter lengths for demos, but you certainly can have a longer length for and go back and forth several times. I just think it gets confusing on a demo to show you the longer length because I'm pulling. So I always tend to do a shorter length. And once again, your tails, you're gonna weave through the warp tunnels. So I just tuck them in on the back for the moment. But that is how you do your pile. And the pile has to alternate with the plain weave. So then the next one now would be a pile. And the pile literally is the plain weave, but you're pulling forward to create a loop on the front. So everywhere where we are over our warp, we pull forward. So that's your pile. That's it for now. I'll see you in class.